The water was the color of bottle glass, and I was 20 feet under it before my brain caught up with what had happened. I remember the cold first. Not the fall, not the impact, not the burn of seawater in my sinuses. The cold. It went through my linen shirt like the fabric wasn't there. And somewhere in the back of my mind, an old voice that sounded like my father said, "Kick." So I kicked. My loafers were already gone. The Patek on my wrist felt like a manacle. I'd been wearing that watch for 31 years, and now it was trying to drag me down to feed the fish. I broke the surface maybe 10 feet from the hull of the catamaran, gasping so hard I sucked in more salt than air. And the first thing I thought was, don't shout. I don't know why that was the first thing. I should have been screaming. Any other man would have been screaming, but something in me, some old instinct from a life I thought I'd left behind in 1979, said stay quiet, stay under. They'll be looking down to make sure. So I let myself sink again, just enough that the chop hid me, and I held there. Above me, on the upper deck of that beautiful $4 million boat I chartered for my 67th birthday, I heard my sister's son say, in a voice I will hear until the day I actually die, oh my God, he just went over. And then, quieter, almost conversational to someone I couldn't see, he'd been drinking all afternoon. I told him to sit down. That's when I understood. My name doesn't matter for the part that comes next. What matters is that I am 67 years old. I sold the logistics software company 3 months ago for $146 million after tax, and the boy I had raised like my own son from the time he was 11 had just shoved me off the back of a yacht in the Adriatic, 12 nautical miles off the coast of Croatia in the dark. Let me tell you how a man gets to that water. Let me tell you how I got there. Because I think if you understand the shape of my own stupidity, you'll understand why what came after was the only thing I could do. I built my company out of a spare bedroom in Naperville, Illinois, in the spring of 1994. My wife was still alive then. Her name was Margaret, and she was the smartest person I have ever known. And she let me put a server tower next to her sewing machine for 8 months while I figured out how to write code that tracked freight movements across the Midwest. We had a daughter, our only child, born late 1989, when we'd both given up on the idea. We called her Hollis, after my wife's mother. Hollis was 5 when I started the company. By the time she was in high school, I was a millionaire, and I had not been home for dinner more than a dozen nights a year. That's the first thing I want you to understand. The man who got pushed off that boat in the Adriatic was not pushed because he was good. He was pushed because for 30 years he had been so good at the wrong things that he never noticed the right things were rotting. Margaret died in 2011, pancreatic. We had 11 weeks from the diagnosis. I sat in that hospital room and I held her hand and I made promises I had no business making about what I would do with the rest of my life. And then she was gone, and I went back to work on Monday. I went back to work on Monday because work was the only language I had ever been fluent in. Alice was 22 and finishing her master's at Northwestern. And she came home for the funeral and looked at me like she didn't know who I was. And then she went back to school and we barely spoke for the next 9 years. My sister, Loretta, had a boy. She'd had him young and she'd had him hard. The father took off when the kid was 6. By the time the boy, my nephew, was 11, Loretta was drinking herself to death in a duplex in Rockford. And Margaret and I drove up one Saturday in September of '99, and we brought him home with us. We didn't adopt him formally. There was no need. Loretta signed a piece of paper and went into a facility, and 3 years later she was gone, and the boy stayed. His name was Cole. We called him Coley when he was small. By the time he was 15, he didn't want to be Coley anymore. He wanted to be Cole, and we obliged him because he was a boy who had lost his mother, and we wanted him to feel like he had some power over something. He was bright. Not Hollis bright. Nobody was Hollis bright, but bright in a different way. He could talk to anyone. He had Margaret's people instincts and my appetite for nice things, and I think now, looking back, I should have seen the second one as a warning a lot earlier than I did. I paid for his undergraduate at Indiana. I paid for his MBA at Kellogg. When he came out of school in 2015, I put him on at the company as a junior product manager, And he was good. He was actually good. He had a way of reading a room that I never had. By 2019, he was running the Western Division. By 2022, when I started seriously thinking about an exit, he was my vice president of operations. And he was the person I trusted most in the world to handle the day-to-day while I went and met with the bankers. I want to be honest about something. I trusted him more than Hollis. I told myself it was because he had stayed in the business and she had not, but that's a coward's version of the truth. The real version is that Cole flattered me. He listened to my stories. He laughed at the right places. He came over on Sundays and watched the bears with me in the basement. Hollis lived an hour away in Oak Park with a partner she had been with for 6 years, a woman she had introduced me to exactly twice, and every conversation we had felt like she was waiting for it to be over. I was a bad father. I am not going to pretend otherwise. I was a bad father, and I let a substitute son walk into the gap I had created, and I called it Providence. The deal closed on August 14th of last year. $172 million gross. After taxes, fees, and the carve-outs I'd promised the executive team, I walked away with $146 million in liquid assets and a foundation structure my estate attorney was still finalizing. Cole got a $5 million bonus and a vesting package worth maybe another $4. It was generous. It was very generous. I remember him hugging me in the conference room and crying a little, and I remember thinking, this is what family is supposed to feel like. 2 weeks later, I told him I was planning the trip. I'd never been a yacht person. Margaret and I had taken cruises when Hollis was young, the regular kind, but I'd never wanted my own boat. I don't have those instincts. But I was turning 67 in October, and I had spent the last 30 years not celebrating anything, and I thought, do it. Do it big. Bring everyone. So I chartered a catamaran out of Split. A real one with a crew of 4, for 10 days running the Dalmatian coast. Orvar, Korčula, Miljet. I invited Hollis and her partner, a woman named Wren, who I had decided to make a real effort with this time. I invited Cole and his fiancée, a woman named Sabine, who I had met exactly once at a Christmas party and who had struck me as the kind of woman who knew the price of everything. I invited my college roommate, Buddy, and his wife. I invited my estate attorney, a man named Pritchard who had been my friend for 20 years and who I trusted with my life, which is more important to the story than I knew at the time. 12 people total, counting the crew. Hollis didn't want to come. I had to call her 3 times. The last time she said, Dad, I'll come for 4 days, not 10. And Wren isn't coming. I said, okay. I said anything. I would have agreed to anything to get her on that boat, and that's worth remembering, too. We sailed on the afternoon of October 6th. My birthday was the 11th. The plan was that, on the night of my birthday, anchored off a cove on the south side of Far, we'd have a dinner on the upper deck with the chef the charter company had brought aboard, and there would be a cake and a toast, and Cole had told me he had a surprise for me. He had been mentioning the surprise for about 3 weeks at that point. I assumed it was a gift, maybe something engraved. The first 3 days were beautiful in a way that didn't seem real. The water, that color I told you about, the islands rising out of it like the spines of old books. House came aboard in High Far Town on the second day, with a duffel bag and the same expression she'd worn at her mother's funeral. She hugged me. She actually hugged me. I held on a beat too long, and she let me. I cried a little in my cabin afterward, and I didn't tell anyone. I want to tell you about the things I noticed and didn't take seriously. Cole talked about my estate 3 times in the first 4 days. 3 separate conversations. The first one was on the second night, at dinner, when he asked me, in front of everyone, whether I had finalized the trust structure. Pritchard, my attorney, looked up from his plate. I changed the subject. The second was the next morning, just the 2 of us on the foredeck, when he said, Uncle, you know if anything ever happened to you, Hollis isn't equipped to handle the foundation. We should talk about co-trustees. I said we'd talk about it when we got home. The third time was the evening before my birthday, when he found me in the salon alone and said, I've been thinking, if you named me as executor, It would take a lot of pressure off Hollis. She's got her own life. She doesn't need this. I said, Cole, we're on vacation. He smiled and said, You're right. I just love you. I want to make sure you're taken care of. I told myself he was anxious. I told myself he was being responsible. I told myself a lot of things. On the morning of my birthday, the captain pulled us into a cove on the south side of Far, where the cliffs come down to the water in these long, pale slabs, and the depth drops away to nothing about 30 feet off the rocks. We swam. We had lunch on the deck. Hollis sat next to me at lunch, and I watched her laugh at something Buddy said, really laugh, the way she used to laugh when she was 8 and her mother was alive, and I thought, I'm going to fix this. I have time. I'm going to fix this. That afternoon, around 4, Sabine, Cole's fiancée, came up to me with a glass in her hand and said, We made you a birthday cocktail. Cole worked on it for an hour. It was something with rum and a Croatian liqueur whose name I couldn't pronounce. It was sweet. I drank half of it and put it down. Sabine watched me drink it. I remember that now. I didn't remember it then. Dinner was on the upper deck. The chef did 6 courses. Cole stood up at one point and gave a toast that made me cry, about how I had saved his life when I took him in, about how he had spent his whole adult life trying to be worthy of what I had given him. And I stood up and hugged him in front of everyone, and I told him I loved him like a son, and I meant it, and that is the worst part of all of this. I meant it. After dinner, sometime around 10, the others started going below. Hollis went first with a headache. Buddy and his wife followed. Pritchard stayed on deck with me and Cole for a while, having a glass of brandy, and then he excused himself too. Sabine had gone down an hour before. It was just Cole and me on the upper deck, with the running lights and the dark water and the chef's mate clearing the last of the plates. Cole said, I want to show you something. He took me to the very back of the upper deck, the part the crew calls the sun pad, where there's a low railing and then a step down to a swim platform that hangs out over the water. He had a phone in his hand. He said, Look at this view. Look at this view. Just stand right here. I want to get a picture of you with the moon behind you. I remember thinking my legs felt heavy. I remember thinking the deck was moving more than it should have been. The boat was at anchor, and the sea was calm, but the deck was moving. I turned around to face him. I had my back to the water. The railing was at the level of my mid-thigh. He raised the phone. He smiled. And then he stepped forward, very fast, and he put both hands on my chest and he pushed. I went over backward. The railing caught my heel and flipped me, and I had a half-second of seeing the underside of the upper deck rushing away from me. And then I hit the water flat on my back and everything went white and cold. I told you what happened next. I told you about the kick and the holding still and hearing his voice from the deck above me saying he'd been drinking all afternoon. I told him to sit down, and that was when I understood that I was not supposed to come up. So I didn't. I swam very slowly, very quietly, under the hull of the catamaran. The catamaran has 2 hulls with a wide gap between them, and underneath, in the dark, there's a kind of cavern where the swim ladder hangs. I got to the swim ladder, and I held onto it, just my face above the water and the shadow between the hulls. I heard him on the deck. I heard Sabine come up fast, the way you come up when you've been waiting. I heard her say, Is it done? I heard him say, He went straight under. He was already half gone from the drink. I heard her say, Don't wake them yet. Give it 10 minutes. Then you scream. That was the moment. I want you to understand what happened to me at that moment. Because it was not anger. Anger came later. Anger came in a flood 3 days afterward, and I almost choked on it. But in that moment, holding onto the rung of a swim ladder in the dark, with my chest heaving so quietly I could barely hear myself, what I felt was something simpler. I felt awake. For the first time in maybe 20 years, I felt absolutely, fully awake. I waited 8 minutes. I counted them on the lit dial of the Paytech that hadn't drowned me after all. At minute 8, Cole started shouting. Real shouting. He shouted my name. He shouted that I'd gone over. I heard feet on the deck above me. I heard the captain. I heard Hollis, my Hollis, scream once, a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. And that was the hardest part of all of it, because in that moment I almost climbed up the ladder. I almost did it. But I had heard Sabine's voice. Is it done? I let go of the ladder, and I swam, underwater as much as I could, toward the rocks. The rocks were maybe 120 yards from the boat. It took me a long time. I am 67 years old, and I do not swim like I used to. And I was, despite everything, slightly drugged. By the time I crawled up onto a slab of limestone at the base of the cliff, I was shaking so hard I couldn't hold myself upright. I lay on the stone for a long time. I could see the boat. They had spotlights on now. I could hear the engine of the tender. They were looking in a small circle around the boat in the wrong direction. I crawled into a fissure in the rock where the spotlight couldn't reach me, and I stayed there until the sky started to lighten. There's a village on the south side of Far called Sveta Nedjelja. It's small. It has a wine bar that's famous for being almost impossible to reach. I knew about it because I had read about it in a travel magazine on the plane over. By the time the sun was fully up, I had walked barefoot and in salt-stiff clothes about 3 kilometers along a goat path I found above the rocks, and I had come down into the village. A woman was opening the shutters of a cafe. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and she didn't scream, which is to her enormous credit. And she said in English, "You need a phone." I said, "I need a phone, and I need you to not tell anyone I am here." She brought me inside. Her name was Jasna. She was maybe 60. Her husband had died 3 years before, of cancer, and she ran the cafe alone, and she fed me eggs and brown bread and gave me a pair of her dead husband's pants and a shirt, and I called Pritchard. I called Pritchard, not Hollis. I have thought about that 1,000 times since. I called Pritchard because I knew that the moment Hollis knew I was alive, her face would change, and her face changing would tell Cole everything he needed to know. I needed Cole to believe I was dead. Pritchard answered on the second ring. He said, oh my God, where are you?" I said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I need you to not say my name. I need you to leave the boat in a tender, alone, this morning, and meet me at a cafe in Sveta Nedjelja. Tell them you have a migraine, and you need to be ashore. Tell them anything. I am alive." Cole pushed me. "I am alive, and I need you to come, and I need you to tell no one." There was a long silence. Pritchard said, "I'll be there in 2 hours." He was there in 3. What I did over the next 19 days, with Pritchard's help, and eventually with the help of a Croatian attorney he found through a friend at the embassy and a private investigator out of London whose discretion cost me more per day than I used to pay my division heads per week, was build the case. I want to walk you through it, because the comments I've read on similar stories always ask the same question. Why didn't he just go to the police? And the answer is that I could have, and they would have arrested Cole, and Cole would have hired the best defense attorney in Chicago, and Sabine would have testified that Cole was on the other side of the deck, and the chef's mate, who I later learned had been paid 8,000 euros in cash a week before we sailed, would have testified that I had been falling down drunk all evening. And the case would have collapsed, and I would have spent my last good years in a courtroom watching my nephew walk free. I did not want that. I wanted what came next. The first thing I learned from the investigator was that Cole and Sabine had been planning this for about 14 months. Sabine was not who she said she was. Her real name was not Sabine. She had been married twice before, both times to older, wealthy men, the second of whom had died in what was officially recorded as a swimming accident in Phuket in 2018. She had been introduced to Cole at a fundraiser in Chicago by a mutual friend, and that friend, the investigator determined, had been paid for the introduction. The second thing I learned was that Cole had been forging documents. Not crudely. He had been adding small amendments to the foundation paperwork I'd been drafting with Pritchard. He had access to my home office because he stayed there when he was in town, and he had photographed pages and he had been working with a paralegal in a small firm in Indiana, an old college friend of his, to draft a version of my trust that named him as co-trustee with broad discretionary powers over distributions. The plan, the investigator believed, was that after my death, this document would be discovered among my papers. Pritchard would have contested it, but Pritchard was old and would have, in the natural course of things, retired soon after my death. The third thing I learned, and this was the thing that broke me, was that Cole had taken out a life insurance policy on me. Not directly. He couldn't have done it directly, but he had encouraged me 18 months earlier to take out a key man policy as part of the company's pre-sale preparation. A $50 million policy with the company as the named beneficiary after the sale. The policy had transferred to the holding entity that held my retained equity. Cole sat on the board of that entity. He had voted with 2 other board members he had cultivated to amend the policy beneficiary to a family trust that he co-controlled. I had not been paying attention. I had been paying him to pay attention. The investigator gave me all of this in a hotel room in Trieste, where Pritchard and I had relocated by the second week. I was supposedly missing at sea. The Croatian Coast Guard had searched for 3 days and called it. There had been a memorial service planned in Chicago for the following week. Hollis was, the investigator told me, in a state. She was barely sleeping. She was at my house every day with Wren, going through my things. She had not, the investigator noted, accepted any of Cole's offers to help with the arrangements. That was the first thing that made me cry in that hotel room. The fact that my daughter, who I had been such a stranger to for so long, had not let my nephew touch my house. I asked the investigator if Hollis was safe. He said, "We don't think she's in immediate danger. He needs the will to be probated cleanly. A second death in the family would be too much." I said, "What about after the will?" He looked at me and didn't answer. That was the night I made my decision. We flew back to Chicago on the 18th day. I had a beard by then, and I had lost 12 pounds, and Pritchard had bought me clothes that didn't fit me right. We came in through Toronto on a private charter that the investigators' firm arranged, and we drove down through Michigan. And we put me up in a safe house in Evanston that belonged to a retired federal judge who owed Pritchard a favor from 20 years back. The memorial was on a Saturday, October 28th. I sat in the safe house and watched a live stream of my own memorial service through a camera the investigator had placed in the floral arrangement at the front of the chapel. I watched my daughter speak. She read a poem her mother had loved. She did not cry until the last line, and then she cried so hard she had to be helped down from the lectern. Cole spoke after her. He spoke for 9 minutes. He talked about how I had saved him. He talked about how he would carry forward my legacy. He cried twice. He cried with the timing of a Broadway actor. I called Hollis from the safe house that night. I want to tell you about that phone call, but I don't think I can do it justice. I will tell you that she did not believe me at first. I will tell you that she was angry, briefly, when she did believe me. Angry that I had not told her sooner. I will tell you that when I explained what Cole had done and what we had learned, she got very, very quiet, and then she said, "Dad, what do you need me to do?" She came to the safe house the next morning. She had told Wren she was visiting a friend. She walked in the door and she saw me and she put her hand over her mouth and she made a sound I had never heard her make. And then she walked across the room and she hit me on the shoulder. Hard. With a closed fist. She said, "Don't you ever. Don't you ever." I said, "I won't. I'm sorry. I won't." We sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours. I told her everything. The forged documents, the insurance policy, the woman whose name was not Sabine, the bottle of liqueur the chef's maid had brought up that night with something in it. I watched my daughter, who was 36 years old and a professor of comparative literature at Loyola, become a person I had never met. A cold person. A focused person. A person who, when I had finished, said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. What we did took 11 weeks. I will tell you the broad strokes, because the details involve people who helped me, who do not deserve to be named on the internet. The Croatian authorities were brought in first, through a back channel at the consulate, with the investigators' full file. They reopened the case quietly. Sabine, whose real name I will not say, was arrested in Geneva on January 9th on an Interpol warrant relating to her second husband's death, which had been quietly re-examined when she became a person of interest in mine. Cole was harder. Cole was in Chicago, living in my house, going through my things, telling everyone how broken he was. We let him do it. We let him do it for 2 more months while Pritchard and the investigators built the financial case, the paper case, the witness case. We had the chef's mate, who had been arrested in Split and who, when offered immunity, gave the prosecutors a 4-hour statement. We had the paralegal in Indiana, who folded the moment her firm's senior partner was contacted. We had bank records, hotel records, phone records, the kind of paper trail that careful men leave when they think the only person who could connect the dots is at the bottom of the Adriatic. On a Tuesday morning in mid-January, federal agents and Chicago police executed a warrant at my house in Lake Forest. Cole was at the kitchen table, eating a piece of toast my housekeeper had made him. He was wearing my robe. Hollis told me later, when I asked, that he didn't even run. He just stood up, and he looked at the lead agent, and he said, "I want to call my lawyer." I was 3 blocks away in a car with Hollis next to me. I had not seen him in 3 months and 4 days. The plan had been that I would not see him at all, that I would let the system swallow him and never lay eyes on his face again. I changed the plan. I walked into my own house through my own front door, while 2 federal agents were taking my nephew out of it in handcuffs. I stood in the foyer. He saw me. He didn't speak. He couldn't speak. His face did something I had never seen a face do. It went through, in about 4 seconds, every shade of color a human face is capable of producing, and his knees buckled, and the agent had to hold him up. I said, "Coley." That was the only word I said to him. The name we used when he was small, when his mother was still alive, when I was a man who hadn't yet learned that the worst thing you can do to a child is give him everything except your attention. He started to cry. Not performance crying, real crying, ugly and broken. I let them take him out. I stood in my foyer and I watched my sister's son go down the front walk in handcuffs, and I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt the way you feel when you have to put an animal down. I felt sick. Hollis came up behind me and put her hand on my back. She said, "Dad, come inside. We'll close the door." We closed the door. That was 15 months ago. Cole pleaded out eventually, after his attorney got a look at the full file. 22 years, federal, with the conspiracy and the fraud and the international elements. He will be in his late 50s when he gets out. Sabine got more in Switzerland for the second husband. The chef's mate is doing 4 years in a Croatian prison. The paralegal in Indiana lost her license and is working in a call center. The 2 board members Cole cultivated were quietly removed and are now defendants in a civil suit that will, I expect, take most of what they have. I am sitting on the porch of a house I bought 10 months ago, on a lake in northern Wisconsin, where Margaret and I came once in 1996, and where I always told her we would retire someday. We never did. I'm writing this on a yellow legal pad because I have come to mistrust screens. My daughter is inside the house. She and Ren got married in May in a small ceremony on this porch. I walked her down a 12-foot aisle made of pine boards I had laid myself, and I cried so hard the officiant had to wait for me to finish. I have given most of the money away. Not all of it. I kept enough that Hollis and Ren will never have to worry, and I kept enough to run the foundation properly, which now funds programs for boys aging out of foster care, which is a thing I should have done 30 years ago and didn't. The rest, the bulk of it, is gone. I gave it away over 6 months, in chunks, to organizations I researched carefully. And when I was done, I felt something I had not felt since I was 23 years old and freshly married and broke. I felt light. I want to say one thing to you, whoever you are watching this. I want to say it because I have learned it the hardest possible way, and I would like, if I can, to save you some of the trip. The people who flatter you are not your family. The people who listen to your stories and laugh at your jokes and watch the game with you on Sundays are not, by virtue of those things, your family. Family is not a feeling. Family is not the easy ones. Family is the people who, when you have not called them in 9 years, will still come down a 12-foot aisle of pine boards and let you walk them, and will still hit you in the shoulder when you scared them, and will still sit at a kitchen table for 4 hours and listen to the worst thing you have ever had to tell anyone, and at the end of it will say, "What do you need me to do?" Cole was not my family. He was the shape of a son that I had used to avoid the work of being a father. I think about Margaret a lot, out here on the porch. I think she would forgive me. I am less sure she would be impressed, but I think she would forgive me. And I think she would be glad I finally figured it out, even if it took going off the back of a boat in the dark to do it. The lake is very quiet tonight. There's a loon out there somewhere. Hollis is making dinner. I can smell garlic. I'm 67 years old. I have been given a life I did not deserve, twice now, and I do not intend to waste the second one. That's all I've got. Thank you for listening. I've thought a lot, since that night in the water, about how a man ends up where I ended up. About cause and effect. About the small, quiet choices that line up over 30 years and deliver you, finally, to the back rail of a boat with your nephew's hands on your chest. The truth is, Cole didn't push me off that yacht out of nowhere. I pushed him toward the rail myself, one missed dinner at a time, one Sunday afternoon when I chose the office over the boy in my basement, one $10,000 gift instead of a real conversation. I taught him, without meaning to, that the way to earn my attention was to want the things I wanted, and to laugh at what I said, and to never, ever ask me where I had been. By the time he was 30, he had learned the lesson too well. He had learned that I valued performance over presence, so he performed, and I rewarded him for it, and the reward kept going up, until the reward became $146 million, and at that point the performance was no longer enough, and the easier path was a railing in the dark. That's the chain. I can trace every link of it back to me. I want to say something to the men my age who might be listening to this, the ones who built something, the ones who sacrificed. The way we were told sacrifice was noble. I want to tell you that the bill always comes. The years you didn't spend with your daughter, with your wife, with the boy you took in, because you thought money was the same thing as love. Those years don't disappear. They wait for you. They wait, and they come back wearing the face of someone you trusted. And they take what you have, and they call it justice. And on some level, you can't argue with them. What saved me in the end was not luck. It was not strength either, though I'll take some credit for the swim. What saved me was a single moment of awareness in the water, when I heard a voice above me and I understood, finally, what was true. After 30 years of looking past the truth about my own family, I looked at it, and it was ugly. And I kept looking. That's the thing I want you to take from this, if you take anything. Look at what's in front of you. Look at the people who flatter you and ask yourself why they're doing it. Look at the people you've neglected and ask yourself if it's too late. It's almost never too late. Hollis hit me in the shoulder when I came back from the dead, and I deserved it, and I am grateful every single day that I lived long enough to be hit. Be honest with yourself. Be brave enough to see your own life clearly, even the parts that shame you. And then do something with what you see. Build something better with the time you have left. That's the only currency that ever really mattered, and I spent most of mine on the wrong things. I'm trying now to spend the rest of it well.